The lounge shimmered with glass walls, imported marble, and silent attendants gliding between guests offering champagne and chilled towels. Everything about the space whispered exclusivity. Everyone knew the rules without ever reading them. So when the young Latino family stepped in tired, holding a baby, dressed modestly, every eye turned. A woman in designer heels wrinkled her nose. A suited man smirked. And then the staff approached. They didn't ask for tickets. They asked them to leave. "This area is for first-class passengers only," they said. The father calmly opened his bag, pulled out 4 black and gold boarding passes, and laid them on the counter. "We know," he replied. What none of the onlookers realized was that this family wasn't just flying first class. They owned the miles, the business, and soon, the spotlight. Because one video from that moment would go viral, and justice was already taxiing down the runway. The airport was alive with the low hum of early morning travelers, the kind of energy that hovered somewhere between anticipation and exhaustion. At gate 54, people shuffled in slow lines, clutched coffee cups, adjusted neck pillows, and kept one eye on the monitors above. But far away from the crowds and fluorescent-lit terminals was the VIP lounge, a glass-walled sanctuary nestled between 2 departure wings, accessible only through a frosted door and a digital scan. It was designed for silence, for exclusivity, for people who flew not out of necessity, but as a lifestyle. That morning, the air inside the lounge was chilled and still. Baristas moved with ballet-like precision behind a marble counter, and crisp newspapers lay folded beside silver espresso spoons. The televisions were muted, and even the children present were unusually quiet, as if they understood the unspoken rules of luxury. Into this carefully composed calm stepped the Mendoza family. Alejandro, his wife Sofia, their daughter Camila, and their infant son Mateo moved together like a unit, slow, intentional, visibly tired but composed. Their clothes were neat but not flashy, functional for travel. Alejandro wore dark jeans and a pressed button-down. Sofia held the baby wrapped in a soft blanket. Camila clutched her backpack and looked around the lounge wide-eyed, half-smiling at the massive windows and plush chairs. The family had just arrived from a domestic connection and were about to board an international flight, one they had saved, planned, and upgraded for months in advance. The lounge attendant didn't see any of that. What she saw was a family that didn't fit the room. Her glance swept over their faces, their clothes, their presence, and stopped short. She didn't smile. She didn't ask for tickets. She stepped forward quickly, intercepting them before they could fully enter the space. Other guests turned their heads slightly, pretending not to watch, but watching all the same. There was no chaos, no yelling, just an instant shift in the air, like static, quiet but charged. The attendant's voice was low but firm, laced with assumption. She asked them to wait outside. Said the lounge was for first-class passengers. That they must be mistaken. That this wasn't a waiting area for the general public. She gestured toward the terminal, toward the crowd, toward where she assumed they belonged. Alejandro didn't argue. He stepped back slightly, placed his carry-on on the ground, unzipped it, and retrieved a slim passport wallet. Inside were 4 first-class boarding passes, printed on thick black cardstock edged with metallic gold. He handed them over calmly. The attendant glanced at them, blinked, and froze for half a second too long. Her smile returned, forced and brittle. She welcomed them in now, gesturing awkwardly toward the seating area as if nothing had happened. But the moment had already stained the room. The family found a spot in the corner away from the stairs. Sofia gently bounced Mateo in her arms while Camila munched on a croissant. Alejandro sat quietly watching the terminal floor below through the glass wall. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But the weight of the stairs, the shift in tone, the gatekeeping disguised as protocol, it settled over him like a cold fog. He had worked his entire life to give his children this level of comfort. He didn't come from wealth. He had started with nothing. And now, even here, even after paying the same premium, showing the same documents, walking through the same doors, he was still asked to prove he belonged. A few seats away, a man in a navy blazer pretended to read while glancing at them repeatedly. His eyes weren't curious. They were assessing. A woman with a silk scarf whispered to her husband, pointing subtly in their direction. Alejandro heard the word "lost" float toward them, muttered under a breath loud enough to be heard but soft enough to deny. No one shouted. No one called them names. But the message was loud and clear. This space wasn't designed for people like them, at least not in the minds of those already inside. Camila tugged at her father's sleeve, asking if she could get another juice. He smiled and nodded. She walked to the counter and waited. The barista ignored her at first, then served another guest who had arrived after. Camila didn't understand. She just stood patiently. Alejandro rose and joined her. Only then did the barista acknowledge them. He placed a hand gently on his daughter's shoulder, thanked the barista, and walked her back to their seats. None of the staff said anything further. No one apologized. No one offered an explanation. But they all watched him now, and he watched them watching. He took out his phone and opened the camera. Not to record, not yet, but to test the angle, to see what could be captured if it became necessary. He knew how quickly stories turned when they went online. He also knew how often they didn't get told at all. He thought about walking to the front desk and asking for a manager. But what would he say? That his family had been assumed unworthy? That his child had been ignored? That he had been ushered toward the door before a word had been spoken? No policy had been broken. No slur had been used. And yet, every part of the experience screamed with the weight of assumption. He closed his phone and looked at Sophia. She met his gaze, nodded once, and adjusted Mateo's blanket. This wasn't new. They had lived versions of this moment before. In hotel lobbies, at restaurants, even in schools. And every time they had chosen grace over fire. But something about this moment, this space, this flight, this future felt heavier. Alejandro wasn't a man who sought revenge. He sought recognition, not applause, just the quiet dignity of being seen. The boarding call came over the lounge speakers, smooth and melodic. First-class passengers to gate 56. The family gathered their things. Camila zipped her backpack. Sophia balanced Mateo in one arm and carried her bag in the other. Alejandro lifted the carry-on and led the way. As they passed the front desk, the attendant looked up but said nothing. He didn't offer a smile either. They walked through the frosted doors, down the polished corridor, toward the jet bridge. Behind them, murmurs rose, subtle and sharp. A phone camera clicked quietly. Somewhere, someone was already crafting a caption. Alejandro didn't look back. Not yet. He had boarded many flights before. But this one, he knew, would carry more than passengers. It would carry a reckoning. The jet bridge buzzed with the quiet anticipation that always preceded international boarding. Airline staff in crisp uniforms offered practice smiles as they scanned boarding passes. Their motions mechanical, their words rehearsed. The Mendoza family stepped forward with a confidence born not of entitlement, but of certainty. They had paid for this seat, this experience, this moment. Yet with each step, the weight of the lounge incident clung to them like smoke after a fire. Alejandro held his son Mateo gently, pressing a kiss to his head as they crossed into the aircraft. Sophia walked just behind him, with Camila tugging slightly at her hand. Excitement and confusion mixed on the young girl's face. The plane's interior opened up like a quiet sanctuary. Clean lines, plush leather seats, ambient lighting that pulsed like a soft heartbeat. They turned left at the split into the first-class cabin. For most of the other passengers already seated, the presence of the Mendoza family prompted another shift. It wasn't verbal, but it was visible. Brows lifted, eyes followed. Subtle exchanges passed between seatmates. There were no objections, no words, but the atmosphere tensed. Not openly hostile, but curiously cold. A woman in pearls reached for her blanket with a glance that lingered on Alejandro just a moment too long. A man in business attire looked up from his tablet with thinly veiled judgment before returning to his screen. The flight attendant, young and overly eager, offered the family a smile that lacked warmth and ushered them to their seats at the front left corner of the cabin. The 4 seats had been selected months in advance. Alejandro had made sure they were grouped together, 2 side-by-side recliners for him and Sophia, with Camila seated just across the aisle in a solo pod and the bassinet arrangement reserved for Mateo in front. It was the most comfortable layout they could manage for a long-haul flight. Alejandro thanked the attendant and began helping his daughter get settled. Sofia reached for the blanket and headphones, organizing her area with gentle precision, humming under her breath to calm the baby. They moved with the efficiency of seasoned travelers, respectful of space and quiet, aware of the optics but refusing to shrink under them. Not long after settling in, another attendant, older, sterner, approached their row with narrowed eyes. She glanced at the seating manifest on her tablet and hesitated before offering service. Her voice lacked the pleasant cadence she used with other passengers. When she offered drinks, her tone was clipped. When she handed menus, her gestures were mechanical. She didn't ask if they had any dietary restrictions. She didn't offer a pre-departure towel. When another guest requested a second glass of champagne, it was delivered promptly. When Alejandro asked for hot water to mix a bottle for Mateo, she nodded but didn't return for nearly 20 minutes. By then, the baby had started to cry. Alejandro stood up, walked to the galley, and quietly retrieved the hot water himself. Back in his seat, he said nothing. Not to the attendant, not to the passengers, not even to Sofia. But his hands moved slower now, with more weight. He kept his voice even, his gestures calm. Camila, sensing the tension in the air, clung to her book, her small body curled in the oversized seat. A child 2 rows behind her kicked the back of a chair and shouted loudly, but no one turned. When Camila laughed softly at a cartoon playing on her screen, a man turned to glare. Sofia pulled her daughter's blanket up, brushing a hand over her head. Alejandro caught her eye. They didn't need to speak. They understood. As the plane taxied down the runway and took flight, Alejandro leaned back and stared at the ceiling. The cabin lights dimmed, and a soft chime signaled that the seatbelt sign had turned off. He pulled out his phone and typed quietly in the Notes app. A few lines, then a paragraph, then more. The words came fast. Not angry, not explosive, but clear and controlled. He described what happened in the lounge. He wrote down the interactions on board. He noted the inconsistencies in treatment, the subtle ways exclusion operated in silence, the ways his family was made to feel tolerated but never welcomed. He didn't name anyone. He didn't ask for sympathy. He didn't dramatize. He just recorded it all, the way a documentarian records facts, the way a witness preserves a story before it's erased by time or doubt. After an hour, he had 4 paragraphs. By the time the meal service began, he had a full post drafted. He saved it in his drafts. He wasn't sure yet if he'd share it. But writing it was its own form of defiance. Dinner came. The family ate quietly, thanking the attendants with sincerity even when the service remained inconsistent. Sofia fed Mateo while Alejandro helped Camila with her food. They asked for nothing extra, made no complaints. Still, a woman in the second row signaled a flight attendant and whispered something while glancing in their direction. The attendant nodded and returned moments later to ask Alejandro if he could please keep things a little quieter. There had been no noise, no disruption, only a baby cooing and a child asking about her pasta. Alejandro looked at her, then at the people who had made space so narrow for a family that had done everything right. He inhaled deeply and let it go. Not because it didn't matter, but because what was coming next would. He reached into his bag, retrieved his laptop, and opened an email chain with a popular blog that often featured travel stories and equity issues. It wasn't just about his family anymore. It was about the pattern, the way systems reinforced hierarchy through soft policing, the way silence perpetuated it, the way people who didn't fit a narrow mold were constantly required to explain, prove, soften, and endure. He began writing, this time not for himself, but for every family that had felt unseen at the gate, unheard at the counter, unwelcome in the sky. He knew the risk, knew the comments would come, but he also knew this, the truth had weight. And sometimes it only took one clear voice to break the hush. Outside the cabin, night pressed against the windows. The city lights far below flickered like embers. Inside, the family sat in stillness, wrapped not in comfort, but in resolve. First class, yes. but never first in perception. Not yet. That, Alejandro decided, was about to change. The hours passed slowly, the hum of the engines a constant background sound as the aircraft crossed the ocean. Most of the cabin had settled into sleep, or at least the performance of it, eye masks drawn, blankets tucked, screens dimmed. But Alejandro remained awake, his mind active, his fingers tapping silently on the laptop's keyboard. The screen's soft glow illuminated his face, focused and calm, as he constructed a message that balanced emotion with restraint, frustration with clarity. He had decided to tell the story not just of what had happened, but of what it represented. This was not a complaint to a customer service department. This was a testimony to a broader truth. His post began with the lounge. The way the attendant hadn't even asked for boarding passes before deciding they didn't belong. How the words used had been polite, but the tone had not. He detailed the expressions of the other guests, the uncomfortable stares, the absence of apology. Then he described the flight, the way service had been inconsistent, the way one polite request for baby formula had been ignored, the way attention was distributed unevenly, quietly but undeniably. He described the looks, not the obvious kind, but the subtle glances of doubt, the kind that scanned you like a threat or an anomaly. It was not about a single moment. It was about the accumulation of them. A pattern that repeated itself across cities, across time, across generations. Alejandro chose his words carefully. He wrote not from anger, but from conviction. He included no names, no seat numbers, no airline employees identifiable by description. But he told the truth. And in doing so, he knew it would resonate. Because they were not alone. Thousands, maybe millions, had experienced some version of this, the slow erosion of dignity through small, dismissive acts. He ended the post with a message to his children, to anyone reading. We paid for our seats. We showed our documents. We followed the rules. But still, we were asked to leave. Let that sink in. He saved the post and closed his laptop. He didn't upload it immediately. Timing mattered. And so did tone. He leaned back and looked over at his wife, asleep now, her arm draped protectively over Mateo. Camila was curled under her blanket, headphones on, eyes flickering with the faint reflections of her screen. They looked peaceful, but Alejandro knew the weight they carried. Even if the children didn't feel it yet, they would. One day, they too would notice the extra steps they had to take. The extra smiles. The extra patience. The quiet compromises they'd make to be allowed in places others walked into freely. Morning began to rise beyond the windows, a soft gradient of light replacing the deep navy of night. The cabin lights adjusted to mimic the dawn, and attendants began to move again, preparing for breakfast service. Alejandro stretched and stood, walking quietly to the galley for a glass of water. This time, he was greeted with more warmth. A new shift, perhaps. A different attendant. Or maybe the others had spoken. It didn't matter. The damage had been done, and the impression was permanent. Back at his seat, he powered his phone and checked for a signal. They were close to landing. Within a few minutes, the in-flight Wi-Fi would reactivate. He reviewed the post one more time, reading it aloud silently in his mind. It was clear, balanced, respectful, and unignorable. He opened his social media app, uploaded the post, attached a caption that simply read, "Flying first class doesn't always mean being treated equally," and tapped publish. He put his phone down and didn't look at it again for a while. Instead, he helped Sophia organize the baby bag, helped Camila with her shoes, thanked the new attendant who brought juice, and waited patiently as the pilot announced their descent. The cabin began to stir again, the once silent travelers returning to life. The woman in pearls applied lipstick. The man in the navy blazer gathered his laptop and checked his watch. No one looked at Alejandro. But he noticed the difference in energy. Subtle. Still wary. But more contained. Perhaps someone had spoken. Perhaps not. The plane landed smoothly, tires squealing slightly on the tarmac before rolling into calm. Applause broke out softly from the rear of the aircraft, a habit held over from shorter flights. First class remained silent. As the doors opened and the passengers disembarked row by row, Alejandro and his family waited. Not to rush, but to avoid the cluster. When it was their turn, they stood, gathered their things, and walked forward with the same grace they'd arrived with. The gate corridor opened into the terminal like a floodgate. Light poured in from wide glass walls. The sound of voices, announcements, rolling suitcases, everything familiar returned. Alejandro checked his phone. Notifications had already started appearing. Hundreds. Then thousands. Shares. Comments. Messages. The post was moving fast. People were responding. Some with anger. Some with support. Some with their own stories. His inbox filled with journalists. Editors. Strangers. People who said, "I've been there and thank you for saying it." He handed the baby to Sophia and stepped aside briefly to read the comments. They weren't all kind, but most were. And that was enough. The story had left the cabin. It was now in the world. He turned to Sophia, who gave him a knowing look. No words. Just the small nod they had shared so many times before. They moved forward as a family, pushing past the signs for customs and toward the future they had always known belonged to them, not because someone allowed it, but because they had claimed it. With effort. With integrity. With truth. The flight was over. But the journey was just beginning. By the time the Mendoza family reached their hotel, the story had already taken on a life of its own. Alejandro hadn't expected it to go viral, not truly. He had hoped it would resonate, yes, spark a conversation maybe, but he hadn't anticipated the reach. By mid-afternoon, his post had been shared by several major advocacy accounts, and a journalist from a well-known travel magazine had published a short article summarizing the events and quoting his words. The headline was firm, unapologetic, "Flying first class while brown, a story that's too common." Within hours, news outlets picked it up. Morning shows, podcasts, influencers. Some reached out directly, asking for interviews. Others debated the broader implications, dissecting the systemic patterns of class, race, and perception embedded in elite travel culture. Meanwhile, Alejandro kept a low profile. The family had arrived for a week-long vacation in Spain, a trip planned months in advance, a reward after 2 long years of non-stop work. He didn't want to spend it fielding calls from strangers or fighting internet battles. Still, he couldn't ignore what was happening. His phone buzzed constantly, notifications, emails, messages from people thanking him, sharing their own stories. Stories from women told to use the service entrance at boutiques. From young professionals mistaken for delivery staff in luxury hotels. From travelers denied upgrades they had earned. Every message was a variation on the same theme, the assumption that they didn't belong. That night, while the city lights of Madrid glittered beyond the hotel balcony, Alejandro sat with his laptop open, responding to a handful of the messages. Not all. Just enough to make the silence feel less heavy. He replied to a teacher from Texas who had once been pulled aside during TSA screening for looking nervous. He answered a father from Atlanta whose teenage son had been asked repeatedly if he was sure his ticket was real. He read a message from an older woman who said his story made her cry because it reminded her of the first time she watched her grandson be treated as less than while boarding a plane in his own country. He didn't post again. He didn't need to. The narrative was moving without him now, carried by people who saw themselves reflected in his words. What started as a personal act of expression had become a mirror for thousands. And Alejandro, though grateful, also felt the familiar weight of being made into a symbol. He hadn't sought attention. He had spoken because staying silent would have felt dishonest. But now that his voice had been amplified, he felt the responsibility pressing against his chest. The following morning, the airline released a public statement. It was vague, full of corporate phrasing, regret for the experience, commitment to inclusivity, promise of internal review. No names were mentioned. No accountability was taken. But they had to acknowledge it. And that, Alejandro knew, was something. Not everything. But something. Within hours, a second statement followed. This one was more specific. It named the flight, admitted that service fell short, and offered a direct apology to the Mendoza family along with a refund and a gesture of goodwill. That gesture included flight credits and an invitation to meet with their executive equity board. It was the kind of public move that came only when a company felt the pressure of visibility. Alejandro didn't respond publicly. Privately, he declined the credits. He didn't want more miles. He wanted change. And so he asked instead that the airline commit to bias training for lounge staff and flight crews in partnership with an organization of his choosing. The airline hesitated. Then, under mounting public pressure, they agreed. A formal partnership was announced 2 days later with a well-respected advocacy group focused on racial equity in travel and hospitality. Alejandro's name wasn't in the press release. But he didn't mind. The work was happening. That mattered more. Throughout it all, Sofia remained quietly supportive. She handled the kids while Alejandro managed the sudden storm of attention. She kept their days grounded, reminding him to unplug, to eat, to walk through the city with their children like they had planned. They visited museums, parks, markets. They tasted new foods, collected stories, and created the kind of memories they had hoped this trip would be about. And yet, the shadow of the incident followed them. It didn't ruin the trip, but it shaped it. Strangers approached Alejandro in public, some to thank him, others just to shake his hand. His story had touched something raw, something unspoken in too many lives. On the fourth day of the trip, a university reached out with a request. Would Alejandro be willing to give a guest lecture via Zoom to their media ethics class? The topic, digital storytelling and systemic visibility. He agreed. Not because he wanted to be seen as an expert, but because he understood how moments like this became inflection points, not just in culture, but in education. During the talk, he kept his message simple: when people tell you the little things don't matter, ask them why the little things keep happening. Why the same patterns appear in different airports, hotels, offices, schools. They're not little things. They're signals. The students listened, asked smart questions, took notes. At the end of the session, the professor thanked him not just for his time, but for reminding the class that storytelling isn't just about content, it's about courage. Alejandro closed the laptop and exhaled. It wasn't the kind of vacation he expected, but maybe it had become something bigger. As the week came to a close, the family packed their bags and prepared for the return trip. This time, they'd fly a different airline. Not out of spite, but out of choice. A subtle assertion of agency. Alejandro booked the flight with his own miles, earned not through status, but persistence. And as they approached the airport once again, his shoulders were lighter. The journey home would not be perfect. It might not even be pleasant. But it would be taken with the quiet pride of a man who had reclaimed the narrative. And somewhere, across the world, others walked through similar terminals with a little more awareness, a little more courage, and the knowledge that someone like them had spoken, had been heard, and had changed something, no matter how small, for everyone who followed. The return to the airport brought with it a strange sense of déjà vu. The architecture was different, the signage in Spanish, the language around them softer and more melodic, but the rhythm of travel remained familiar. Alejandro pushed the luggage cart with one hand, holding Mateo's bottle in the other, while Sofia kept Camila close, her tiny suitcase rolling behind her in practiced steps. The terminal was bright, clean, and busy, but not chaotic. In some ways, it felt more welcoming than where their journey had begun. And yet, beneath the surface, a quiet apprehension lingered, something unspoken but felt. This time, they were prepared for everything, not because they wanted confrontation, but because they understood that even a return flight could carry echoes of the first. As they approached the check-in counter for their flight home, Alejandro felt his posture shift. Not defensive, but deliberate. He placed the documents neatly on the counter, handed over the passports with a polite nod, and answered every question with measured calm. The clerk, young and cheerful, processed everything smoothly, even smiled at Camila when she asked about the gate number. There were no raised eyebrows, no hesitation, no second glances. Just efficiency. It almost felt strange. At security, the process repeated itself. Friendly agents, a smooth walkthrough, no excessive screening. Alejandro watched it all with quiet curiosity. It wasn't that he expected to be mistreated again, it was that he had learned not to expect fairness either. When they finally made it to the boarding area, they found seats together and waited like any other family. The lounge this time wasn't even an option, they had decided they didn't need it. Not because they didn't qualify, but because they no longer wished to place themselves where their dignity could be questioned so casually. Comfort shouldn't come with the risk of erasure. As they waited, Alejandro checked his phone. His story was still circulating, still drawing attention. More outlets had covered it. A national morning show had aired a short segment summarizing the events and inviting commentary from travel experts. Another op-ed had appeared, this time written by a former flight attendant who admitted to witnessing and even participating in subtle acts of discrimination under the guise of policy. Each new ripple added to the reach. But more important to Alejandro were the private messages still trickling in, stories from strangers who had found in his words a kind of validation they had never experienced publicly. He wasn't sure how to feel. Part of him was proud. Another part felt displaced. He hadn't asked to become a spokesperson. He had simply shared what happened. Yet now others were expecting him to lead, to guide, to organize. His inbox was filled with requests for interviews, invitations to panel discussions, and suggestions to build a platform. It was flattering but also exhausting. He wasn't an activist. He was a father, a husband, a business consultant with deadlines and meetings and 2 kids who needed him to be present, not just public. But he also understood that silence could no longer be his shield. He had been seen, and once seen, you couldn't disappear again, not fully. Boarding began. The Mendoza family rose with the first group, their boarding passes marked with the number 1 in bold. No one questioned it. No one blocked them. They were welcomed with smiles, directed to the forward cabin, and escorted to their seats without incident. The cabin was quieter than the last. A different airline, a different energy. The seats were comfortable, the crew professional and warm. Alejandro exhaled, but not fully. He knew better than to let his guard down completely. The flight took off without delay. Camila fell asleep with her head on Sophia's shoulder. Mateo dozed in the bassinet. Alejandro reclined and opened his notebook. Not his phone, not his laptop, just a notebook and pen. He began writing. Not a post, not a speech, but a draft of something he had been turning over in his mind for days. An idea. A guide, perhaps, a way for other travelers from marginalized backgrounds to prepare themselves, to advocate for themselves, to hold institutions accountable without needing a viral moment to do so. It would be practical, empathetic, grounded in lived experience. Not a manifesto, but a map. As the plane cruised above the Atlantic, Alejandro continued writing. He detailed what to expect from lounges, what questions to ask at check-in, how to document interactions, who to contact in case of bias. He included a section on children, how to prepare them for environments that might not welcome them with the ease they deserve. He wrote a part on healing, how to cope after these small, sharp injustices wear you down. And finally, a section on power, how to reclaim it through language, community, and persistent visibility. He paused occasionally to sip water or glance out the window, but his focus never broke. This was the kind of work that felt necessary, not performative but practical. By the time the crew dimmed the lights for the overnight portion of the flight, Alejandro had filled 6 pages. He tucked the notebook away, satisfied not because it was finished, but because it had started. A seed had been planted. He didn't know what form it would eventually take. Maybe a free online resource, maybe a short book, maybe nothing more than something he shared among friends. But it was real now. It existed. When the plane landed just after dawn, the airport felt familiar again. This time, there were no cameras, no viral aftermath waiting. Just a family walking through customs, tired but intact. As they exited the arrivals hall, Alejandro turned off airplane mode. His phone lit up with new messages. One caught his eye. It was from a major civil rights organization. They wanted to talk about collaborating. Not just about travel, but about corporate equity, representation in customer-facing industries, long-term strategy. Alejandro read it slowly, then handed the phone to Sofia. They looked at each other, not with surprise, but with understanding. Their journey was not ending. It was shifting. The story that had begun in the quiet humiliation of a lounge was becoming something larger. Something that couldn't be contained in a boarding pass or a viral thread. It was becoming part of a movement, a soft, steady wave that no one could pretend not to see anymore. And at its center was a man who had once just wanted to fly in peace, who now carried the truth not like a burden, but like a torch. Weeks after returning home, Alejandro found himself walking through a terminal once again, this time for work. He was alone. No family, no strollers, no coloring books or baby bottles. Just a laptop, a slim carry-on, and a stack of documents tucked into his briefcase. He was scheduled to speak at a private corporate seminar on inclusive travel culture, invited by a global airline alliance that had seen the ripples his story created. It wasn't something he would have imagined months ago. The idea of standing in front of executives, addressing their staff about microaggressions, bias, and silent exclusion had once seemed distant, like someone else's responsibility. But the journey had transformed him. Not into an activist, not into a public figure, but into a man who could no longer pretend that silence was safe. The seminar room was sleek and modern, filled with senior flight staff, hospitality executives, and HR coordinators from around the world. Most of them had read his story. Some had seen the viral posts. Others had only heard of the event through internal memos. But all of them were there because change had suddenly become measurable, not just in morality but in numbers. Social perception had value. The risk of inaction now had cost. Alejandro wasn't bitter about it. In a way, it was justice through economics. If conscience didn't move institutions, sometimes pressure did. He began his talk without slides, without fanfare. He simply told the story again, this time stripped of emotion, presented as a case study in perception and policy failure. He walked through the sequence of events. The assumptions in the lounge, the differential treatment in the cabin, the silence of those who noticed and did nothing. He described how these moments, while not explosive, compounded into something corrosive. He showed how respect isn't just about formal titles or scripted greetings. It's in the tone, the glance, the unspoken invitation or rejection. Some in the room nodded. Others squirmed. A few wrote notes furiously. He didn't call anyone out by name, didn't use anger, didn't moralize. He simply held a mirror to their system and asked a simple question. Who is your service designed for? Not in brochures, not in training manuals, but in practice, in instinct. When he finished, there was a pause. The silence felt loaded, not empty. Then came the applause, polite at first, then growing. A few came up afterward to thank him. One woman, a flight attendant for over 20 years, admitted it was the first time she'd heard a passenger's story presented with such clarity. She didn't defend, didn't excuse. She simply said she would do better. Alejandro left the seminar with no illusions. The work ahead would be slow. Real change always was. But seeds had been planted. Ideas had been introduced. The door had opened a fraction wider. That was enough for now. Back at home, life resumed its rhythm. Work, school pickups, late dinners, bedtime stories. The world hadn't paused for their viral moment, and Alejandro was grateful for that. The normalcy grounded him. It reminded him why the story mattered in the first place. Not for fame, not for attention, but for the quiet right to move through the world without shrinking. He received occasional updates from the airline he had flown. A new training module had been implemented. Bias audits were underway. Staff rotation in lounges was being restructured to diversify the face of first contact. These were small steps, incremental, but real. Camila had since told her teacher about the trip. She had described the plane, the big seats, the food trays. But she had also talked about how people looked at her and how her dad had written about it. Her class ended up discussing fairness that week, not because of a textbook, but because a little girl described how her family had been asked to leave a room they had paid to enter. Alejandro learned this during a parent-teacher conference, and it struck him harder than anything else. The story had changed something, not just in systems, but in his own daughter. She knew now how to name the feeling. In time, the momentum faded. The online chatter moved to the next controversy. Algorithms forgot, but Alejandro didn't. He continued to write, quietly mentoring a small network of travelers, contributing essays, reviewing policies for a few companies that sought his insight. Nothing dramatic. No book deals, no speaking tour. Just steady work. Just lasting impact. He often reflected on the irony that all of this began not with a confrontation, but with a dismissal. That what others tried to erase became the very thing that reshaped the space around it. He had once believed that dignity was something you claimed through silence and composure. Now he understood it differently. Dignity was defended by speaking up, not for validation, but for restoration. On the anniversary of the incident, he and Sophia booked another trip. Not to commemorate, but to celebrate. They chose a destination they had never visited. upgraded without hesitation, and walked into the lounge without bracing themselves. There were still glances. There always would be. But this time, they walked with the certainty of people who had changed the terms of belonging not just for themselves, but for everyone who looked like them, who had been made to feel like guests in spaces they had earned. As the plane ascended through the clouds, Alejandro closed his eyes, leaned back, and exhaled. This wasn't the end of the story. It never would be. But for the first time in a long while, it felt like a beginning. One written not in outrage, but in purpose. In quiet, undeniable truth. And that he knew would always fly farther than anything else.